Doing a quick review of the recently released video on YouTube from Mike Jones with Inspiring Philosophy. The video is titled Early Resurrection Belief Jesus is Not Just a Legend. And there's a lot more that goes into this study of the resurrection and it being the central part of the storyline. But I guess initially, so just starting to casually talk about it, I've talked about it before in the past, is that a part of what's kind of useful about the resurrection being vague is that it causes people to have to look at the other parts of the story, like the meaning of this whole sequence of death and resurrection. Take, for example, there's others in scripture where there's this ascension into heaven within the story, Enoch and Elijah. And it's kind of peculiar as to what that is supposed to indicate in the story. I mean, because there's other efforts within the progression of the story that create this whole likeness of this transformative kingdom story that's just developing and developing. But so there's other characters that had, pushed the transformative story forward. For instance, like Moses, and he doesn't just ascend into heaven, right? He dies and then he is proclaimed to have gone to heaven. That's the assumption, because then later, like way later in the story, he appears among various ones with Elijah in kind of like a heavenly form or whatever. But he doesn't just directly ascend into heaven. And so then you look at the story and you think, what is that supposed to indicate? Whereas there is a portion where the stage of Moses indicates the law, right? And so it could be like the use of the story along those lines is this portrayal of the law. And then the ascension is this portrayal of aligning with God and then just being brought into a type of transformative relationship with God without the stage of death. And, maybe that's some function of it within the story. And so the fact that Jesus has both the death and then the resurrection and then the ascension seems to suggest he's part of the story of the law and death, but then also he's part of the story of reemerging the spirit and ascension into metamorphosis unto God. Almost as though this testimony that there should have initially been some form of progressing into ascension or transformation apart from the law and death. And so, because the portion of death, when people think about it, is like they think only good can come from death. There needs to be evil, there needs to be death for there to be good. But this seems to bring a corrective measure as to no, death wasn't part of the original design. Death was something that got corrupted into the system, and then there's this whole skewed system and then integration into the system through the temple and those mechanisms that then transforms it and returns it back into the ability to understand the full parameters and mapping out of that whole system unto death and the confusion of integration into the good involved in it and then refining it, the whole sequence of things. So it could be that it functions along those lines to some degree. But then it does get into this question of did they literally then ascend? Was there a portion of their being represented in ascension? Is it a separation between like the spirit that ascends and the flesh that continues to be incorporated in the system of death until it reaches the point of like transforming those portions as well? Is there something else going on in terms of the story? But anyway, so you could still suppose about that. But when you think about it, we don't spend a lot of time arguing over whether is it true? Can we still read the story and the transformative value? Like, can we prove that Enoch really did ascend? Can we prove that Elijah really did ascend? We don't really spend too much time thinking about that because they've already served the purpose of being integrated into portions of the story. And so it seems like at some point, the stage of Jesus, if there wasn't, so one of the threats of the crucifixion was that it would end the transformative aspects of the movement. And so if there wasn't some kind of vague belief, like, did he resurrect? Did he survive this? Is the movement over? So it kind of, like, that vague stage of it, people kind of not totally sure, testimonies that maybe it happened, but then he does come back, but then he ascends, and so he's not with them. A lot of that does seem to help to function, to keep the story going, to keep the transformative value going. But then also, because it's vague, because he didn't make it so obvious, it serves to both keep it going, but then not make everything actually depend on it. Because it seems like the larger significance is that the full mapping of transformative value of the kingdom to realign us into the original design of transformative spiritual value through our physical experience unto God is still able to be achieved as we understand transforming the kingdom of the world power. And if we focus too much on looking at Jesus as an outward leadership, I mean, there is that, like, there's the outward value of others and whatnot, but the outward value that we increase with others is if we increase the spiritual value of centering within ourselves. And if we continue to look on an outward mechanism for dependence on spiritual growth, it doesn't really serve the original purpose and design we were made in, to facilitate that spiritual development from within us that flows from within and then outward to reach our spiritual metamorphosis or transformative connection to God. And so at some level, it's something that I look at the storyline and see, what are we supposed to do with these portions, though? How do we connect the spirit of the text and spirit of the movement? And because, for one, if it was just a matter of Jesus proving that he can be crucified and then be resurrected, then if the actual power was that he shows this outward manifestation where he conquers death, and then that's it, and then people look to him, if that was simply all that he was manifesting, if we're supposed to look on the death and resurrection, we're not really seeing the testimony of that as the spiritual transformative value among us and among, like, the effects among the physical creation and connection and whatnot. And so that's also, then you get the story of the, like, ascension, right? Where the physical manifestation is not there. And so then that gives testimony to both the relief from the limitation of the world dominion, but then also the mystery of the connection of what we were supposed to do besides being fixated on some outward force controlling the world dominion, as though continuing to keep writing into the equation the world dominion as a necessary component. And so it's kind of looking forward into the transformative stages, and what does that mean in original practice? So anyway, I'm just saying that's why it seems like the vague, like, not quite understanding and not really getting the sure answer, in some ways keeps the mystery of the growth going, because they don't quite get what they think they want in terms of an outward king to take over the other king in the same reference of what they think is the stage of growth. They get the ability to see that the system doesn't have the ultimate power, but then they still have to look forward to like the transformative value. Now I'm kind of getting repetitive, but I feel like I'm trying to explain that like a little bit more from various angles. For instance, like even if they proved, like, at this point, now that the spirit of the message has taken hold and there's a transformative direction and vision for where to go with it and what it functions through, at this point, even if someone said we have 100% proof that he didn't literally resurrect, it wouldn't really shake the power of this, the actual power of transformative power of the story. like if it just kind of portrayed that Jesus died and there was just like this spiritual manifestation that quickened us, and then it produced and facilitated this revelatory understanding in us, and then in doing so helped us to refine and connect ourselves with the way that energy and forces and spiritual alignment functions, and then through that we produce this transformative interrelationship of things. We could still do that, like the revelation would still produce that. So at this point, now that we know that, now that the vagueness has served to establish in us what the actual revelation is, for me personally, I don't feel like arguing if it was, like if someone said, we have proof it wasn't a literal resurrection, it was a spiritual, this other thing happening. Or if they did prove 100%, we know it was a death and resurrection. It just doesn't really, I feel like the power of the story isn't really about that. There is an aspect, though, of the power of that revelation to some degree. There needed to be some sense of the story didn't just end, the powers didn't just keep killing off revolutions, that the revolution continued. So there is a power to the story. I'm not saying there isn't, but like there's a spiritual transformative value to it. But like focusing on, was it literal or was it spiritual? Just seems like we're not supposed to just keep focusing on proving that, but showing the manifestation of like the testimony of change, I guess. And so if someone says, well, if you don't focus on it and prove it, then it undermines the ability to do such and such. And I guess I don't really know that it does, because some of what it seems like he needed to do, like what the Christ Act needed to do, was to utilize the components by which world powers improperly tapped into life force effects and used it to hold people hostage. And so it seems like some of what he had done in terms of the way that he set up the and surrendered into this like mechanism for his death, he situated his death in such a way where it put in check all those improper forces, and through practices, through the revelation of a corrective path of understanding, then it seems as people understand what that corrective path is and to align themselves with the way that life actually functions, that message of what it testifies increases, and it actually does continue to put in check the improper mechanism that the corrupted world aspect of like corrupted power utilizes. And so that still does function. And so it is important to look at what is the sequence of the death act and what portion is the spirit testifying that which continues to go forward transformed from that pivot point or intersecting of events. So there is that. But anyway, I don't know if that makes sense, but those are just kind of my initial ideas as we revisit some of this question. But anyway, just I'll, maybe think about it some more.